Hi everyone, I'm Chloe. I'm tuning in from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I saw there were quite a few Pittsburghers online today. Some I recognize, many I don't. So welcome to those of you who are locals. Um, Definitely a weird time to, be connecting with a local community when you can't even really see them in person. But also welcome to everyone from all around the country. Maybe we have some people from around the world, I don't know, but welcome, everyone, welcome. And thank you to Slow Food for organizing this. This is a really, really cool thing. I think it's the perfect time to do it, to try it out. I've never done something like this before. I do have a sourdough business and I do teach workshops, usually for somewhere around 10 people in a room, not over 200 people at a time. But I think this is going to be really fun, and I'm going to try to speak to everyone. I know we probably have a few people out there who are already a little familiar with sourdough. So this may just be review for you. Maybe you'll still learn some new things, but I'm really going to be trying to speak to the baseline here. People who have no idea what sourdough is, or just have learned a little bit about it and want to take the next step to actually make their own starter. So I'll tell you a little bit more just about what I do and how I got involved. Maybe it'll inspire you as you go forward on your own sourdough journey. First of all, this is the name of my business, Crust Worthy. It's located in Pittsburgh. It's all community supported, locally produced by me. It's a one-woman bakery. So locally produced sourdough. I use all organic grains in my baking. Everything is naturally leavened with my sourdough starter. I do breads. I do have pastries which contain sourdough starter. They're not necessarily leavened all the time, but we can get into that more if we have time towards the end to talk about other uses for your sourdough starter outside of bread. But I just kind of fell into this. I don't have culinary training beyond having worked as a pastry assistant for a year and a half. That was actually at a gluten-free bakery. So gluten-free people out there who want to bake gluten-free sourdough bread, we can talk about that too if there's time. It's definitely possible. It's very different, but it's possible. Today we'll be focusing mostly on wheat-based sourdough, which is really the foundation of my business. It is, it's definitely something that you can teach yourself. It takes a lot of practice. If you're lucky, you'll get a good loaf within the first year of trying it out, maybe. I don't mean to scare you. I just mean, it's something that you really have to play with and learn how it works to really feel comfortable and in your element, maybe. If you're someone who likes to really have a lot of control over what you're doing, this may be a great exercise for you to let go and just to follow along and practice your intuitive side. Being able to control certain things, the temperature, the ingredients, those are going to really come into play as well. But just know that there's a little bit of magic that happens, and just try to follow along with what the starter is doing, and hopefully it'll be a really fun thing for you to do. The other links that I have up here, one of them is an email address. If you have any questions beyond this this webinar, feel free to email me there. The other link up on this board and possibly elsewhere in this organizing this whole thing is my website. It's also linking to a specific page, the ordering page. I don't do anything outside of local deliveries, and I'm actually not doing anything at the current moment, but you can go to the website, Crust Worthy PGH. PGH is for Pittsburgh, so crustworthypgh.com. That brings you to my website. If you want to find out how you can support my business, you can go to the ordering page. There are ways to do that there. I'll talk about that more towards the end. I'm a little bit anxious to get started on the sourdough part of this. So that's what all that is, in case you're wondering what that's about. For this workshop, some of you may be tuning in and wanting to do it along as I go. That's great. What you'll need for this workshop is some flour, what kind of flour to use? Well, that kind of just depends on whatever you have in your house. If you have, you know, all-purpose flour, something called bread flour, which is basically like a higher gluten, higher protein flour, that's great. If you have whole wheat flour, that's great. Rye flour, that's great. It's all great. It all works. Maybe if you can, if you're trying to do a gluten sourdough, something containing gluten, you know, bread flour or whole wheat flour or a mix of the two would be great to start out with, but really just grab whatever you have. If you happen to have something that's a little bit fresher, maybe that might also help you with building a starter just in the beginning. You know, fresher flour is going to have fresher food basically for the microbes that are going to want to come and make their home in the starter. But if you don't, that's okay. And you can just try and try and try until you catch something. So you'll need the flour. You're also going to need some water. The water temperature should be probably about room temperature. You know, you don't want it to be too cold. You don't want it to be too hot. It's kind of a Goldilocks paradigm there. So just some water. If you have, if your tap water is okay to drink, you know, it should be okay for your starter as well, preferably non-chlorinated. If you're worried about using the tap water, you can definitely use filtered water or spring water or whatever, again, like whatever you have. I know it's not exactly the easiest time to go out to the store and get the most ideal ingredients. So just start with whatever you have at home. And you can always adjust, you know, if it doesn't work out the first time or you want to try something different, you can go, you know, once things are different and try out some different ingredients. But for now, just use whatever kind of flour you have at home and tap water or spring water or bottled water, whatever you have. You're also going to need a container for your starter. Now for a container, I recommend having something that's clear, you know, something that you can see through. That way you'll be able to monitor visually where your starter is at. You'll be able to see activity really well. So I have a couple of recommendations on what you could use. Again, this is just going to be whatever you have at home, but a mason jar is a really great place to start. Here's one that I'll be using today. Doesn't have to be, you know, a huge container, but you want it to be big enough that your starter has room to expand. So something this size would be great. I prefer using the wide mouth containers because you're going to be kind of reaching in and stirring, and it's trickier to do whenever it's got a narrow opening. It's clear so you can see. You could also use, you know, if you tend to keep takeout containers or like those little Ziploc or Glad containers, those work pretty well, like the plastic stuff. This is a great one, you know, like a great shape to use, great size. It also has a nice little lid, which with the mason jar, you know, you also have those matching lids, which are nice. And you don't want them to seal completely when you're doing a starter. You know, you don't want it to just be airtight. You're going to want to leave a little bit of room for the starter to release gases. So flour, water, a container. You may also want to have some kind of a stirring utensil if you don't want to use your hands, which, you know, you can use your hands. And I actually love using my hands when I'm mixing my starter or working with my bread. Obviously, I'm touching it all the time. That's part of what makes it fun for me. But if you don't necessarily want to get covered in flour and water today, you can, you know, have a knife or a butter knife or a spoon or a spatula, something nearby to mix your starter with. The only other thing that you'll need for this is some kind of measuring tool. Now, I like to encourage my students when I'm teaching workshops, if you can, and if you already have one at home, there we go. Sorry, the mirroring effect on this is a little tricky to figure out. A digital scale is a really, really good tool if you're getting started with sourdough baking. It is a really exact way, like precise way to measure your flour and your water. It kind of removes a lot of room for mistakes whenever you're working with dough, measuring out for recipes. They also are really multi-purpose tools. I mean, you don't have to use them just for baking. A lot of them have different units that you can use, you know, ounces, grams, whatever whatever you fancy. And for keeping a starter, it's an especially useful tool. We'll get into that more later, but if you have one, digital scale, I recommend grabbing that. If you don't have a scale, that's fine too. You can start out by using just tablespoons, teaspoons, whatever you have, measuring cups, and you can kind of eyeball it. It doesn't have to be an exact science. That's part of why I like to say that sourdough can be an intuitive sort of baking process. It's a mix of the two, really. You can't go completely off of knowing what you're working with. You can, but I recommend maybe going by the books a little bit in the beginning to just get a feel for it. All that just to say, if you have measuring tools that are by volume rather than by weight or by mass, which would be the scale, you can use that as well. I'll be teaching both ways today. It's basically the same process. It's just a different way to measure it and a different way to keep along with your starter. So I'm going to introduce you to my starter, first of all. His name's David, David Dowie, and I fed David last night. Here's another thing I forgot to mention. See, I knew this would happen. I like to put a rubber band or make a mark on where my starter is when I feed it. So I can see how much he's grown. So you can see already that he has grown twice his size. He has lots of happy fermented bubbles. He's pretty bubbly on top too. You can see him coming down the sides there. Ooh, this is really hard to control. He smells great. It smells kind of like cheesy in a really good way, not like a super sharp cheese, but just like a almost floral. Can sourdough be floral? I think it can be floral. Really pleasant scent. It doesn't smell vinegary. It doesn't smell moldy. If your starter does start to smell like that, it may mean it's time to start a new starter. It may also just mean that it's really, really hungry. You're gonna have to follow your intuition a little bit. You can also always check the internet, say if you start to see signs with your starter that you're not sure about. We'll get into that more later, but just know that it should really be pleasing to the eye, to your nose. You can taste it if you want to. It's not going to kill you. It'll just taste a little funky. But that's how you can kind of keep track of your sourdough and know that it's in a good place when it's looking bubbly and healthy like this. So this is mine. That's what we're going to get to eventually. It's going to take probably about a week of building your starter, so don't expect to be able to bake bread tomorrow. But it's a really fun and easy process. So let's get started with whatever container you have. I recommend, if you're using a scale, to actually weigh out how much your container weighs. Just your container, just your container, no lid, nothing in it. So I'm going to weigh mine out, and what this is called is is taring your container, T-A-R-E. I'll write it down. Sometimes on your scale it says tare, and that just means basically setting at 0. It's like measuring what your baseline is. So I turn my scale on, and when I lift it up it goes crazy, but basically I want to press the unit button and make sure that I'm measuring in grams. Most sourdough recipes that you see are going to be in grams. That's just kind of the baker's standard for sourdough, and a lot of other cooking recipes, elsewhere in the world, lots of European recipes and whatnot, use grams. It's a really good habit to get into if you are already starting to use a scale or already use one at home. So today we're going to work in grams. You're going to want it on an even surface, which I'm sorry I have to do off screen. Otherwise I risk my whole laptop situation collapsing. So right now it's set at 0, and I'm just going to take my glass container and put it down on the scale, and it reads at about 285 grams for my container. I've actually made a note of that on my other container. You can see here that I measured it out, and I put just a little piece of tape, so I always have that as reference. Now I know what my container weighs like, so now I know how much starter is in here if I'm ever weighing the whole thing on my scale. All I have to do is put the whole thing on my scale and subtract 285, which is my container, to get the amount of starter. That's just really useful to use going forward whenever you're going to bake bread. Hey, thanks. I think it's smart too. I see that comment. So we've weighed our container. I'm gonna now put this down and just tear, that word we learned, tear the container, which means I put it on my scale, I put it on my scale and I hit the button that says tear, and now everything is set to 0. So I'm working with a completely zeroed out container. Now it's time to add the flour. Here's some bread flour. I recommend, if you can afford it, if you already have it, or maybe later on if you want to switch over to it, I recommend using organic flour. I recommend using unbleached, unbromated, unenriched. That's basically just going to give you the most natural and environmentally friendly flour that you can use. It's going to support the kinds of grain economies that we want going forward in this world, especially if you can get your grain from a local grower or local miller or both. You can do a little bit of research about that. If you're in Pittsburgh, Frankfurt Farms has some really great resources on that. They sell at a couple of markets around town, at the East End Co-op, and I think they sell the Whole Foods as well. Whole Foods probably also has some good resources for other people in other parts of the country. Just check in and see, what the best way to purchase flour is. Again, I know we're in a really weird time right now and that might not be possible, but just something to keep thinking about moving forward. So yeah, so even though it looks white, this is organic, unbleached, unbromated, unenriched flour. The starters love it, sourdough loves it. It's great to work with, and it's great for everyone. So you can use bread flour. I actually like to add a little bit of whole wheat flour into my starter as well, which I don't have a nice container for my whole wheat flour. It's just a cup that I got out of a bigger container. But it's got more brand to it. It's got more color, which, gosh, that's going to be hard to show. There you go, against the white container. It's going to have a little bit of like a grittier feel if it's whole wheat. You can do all whole wheat for sure. Plenty of people use all whole wheat starters. Whenever I bake a 100% whole wheat bread, I like to use a whole wheat starter. Basically, whatever you have on hand, whatever you want to do in your baking, whether it's all whole grain, you want to do all bread flour, you want to be baking more like white loaves. Just use whatever you got. To start, I often like to recommend doing sort of a half and half situation if you have bread flour and the whole wheat flour on hand. So that's what we're going to do today. That's going to give your starter a really nice rise. The bread flour has a really high gluten content, so it's going to form those networks and allow that gas to really lift it up. And the whole wheat flour is going to give a really nice nutritional boost to that starter and give it a lot of nice tasty starches and sugars to feed on. So I'm going to do a half and half of bread flour and whole wheat flour. To start out, you want to start with a pretty small amount. So I'm going to start with just 25 grams of the whole wheat flour and 25 grams of the bread flour. Which I'm just going to abbreviate to BF, my best friend bread flour. So a total of 50 grams of flour, right? And that's going to be matched with just 50 grams of water. So you want them to be equal amounts of flour to water. That's the key, is keeping that consistent equal amounts. It gets a little bit trickier if you're using measuring spoons or measuring cups. You kind of want to go a little bit under on the water because that mass measurement is going to be higher for the same amount of volume, right? So like 2 tablespoons of flour is going to have less mass than 2 tablespoons of water. So you might just want to go a little bit under if you're doing it that way. So now let's start measuring out, and I'll kind of show you in between what I'm doing. Rewinding a little bit, I have my container on my scale. It's set at 0 grams. Yes, under with water. I'm now adding in some of my bread flour, and you could do all bread flour if you wanted. You could do all whole wheat flour. So I'll just add in, 25 grams of bread flour. Here's another tip. I like to start by adding my flour in first. That way, if I go over too much, it's easier for me to take flour out than it is to take it's easier for me to take the flour out than it is for me to take flour out of water, if that makes sense. You'll understand if you start to try different ways to mix it in different steps, but that's just what worked for me. It doesn't really matter whether you add the flour or the water first. You can either, you can also, measure it out in different containers if you want. I don't like to do more than I have to, so I just do it all in one container. So now we've got 25 grams of bread flour in here. This is what it looks like, not that much. And now I'm gonna, again, tare my scale so that everything is set to 0 again. I like to now add in my whole wheat flour. So I'm adding that in slowly, slowly. And now I'm at 25 grams of whole wheat flour. So you can see the two of them together. And the last step, water. I tried to grab everything ahead of time that I could think of. Everything is set to 0, and now I'm adding 50 grams of water. And you want to go pretty slowly with the water. Sometimes one drop comes out and it puts you far along, it seems. Especially when you're working with such small amounts, really go slow. It's better to have to add more than to try to take out some. It's not a huge deal if you go over a little bit, if you get like 51 grams of water, 52 grams of water, whatever. That's not too big of a deal. You just want to get roughly in the same range. So here's what we're looking at now. We got our 2 kinds of flours, and we have our water in there. The next step is to just take, whatever kind of stirring utensil you want. You don't need to worry too much about material here. A metal utensil is fine. It's just going to be there for a minute to mix it all together. You can use your hands too, and that can be pretty fun. But I'm just going to be stirring now. And part of what's great about the clear container is that you can tell if you have bits of flour sticking to the side where you need to still mix in. So here we go. It's going to look pretty pasty at first. And part of the reason for that is the flour hasn't really had time to absorb the water yet. But over time, it's going to absorb that water. And it's going to form gluten networks. And then it's going to start to expand. And what's going to be happening there is, we'll get to that in a bit, actually. I'm making a little bit of noise right now, so I want to just finish stirring this. You really want to stir it well. There we go. I just kind of scrape off whatever's on the utensil at the top and maybe kind of help that back down. So there we go. Now it's stirred down a little bit. Before it was kind of up to here when we had all the ingredients together, but now they're all mixed together, so it's not quite as big. Once you get it kind of settled down and you can see where it sits, if you have a rubber band and you want to track the progress, you can put it on. So I have that kind of as a marker for where my starter is starting at. Now again, you're probably not going to see much activity on the first day. Maybe in a few days you might start to see it bubble. You might get some funky smells. hopefully good funky smells. But don't expect too much in the first couple of days. If you live in a warmer environment, you know, sourdough starters really do get more active when it's warmer outside. Sometimes that's to your detriment if it's 100 degrees. You know, your starter can go a little crazy and it can be kind of hard to keep track of it. To stay on top of those feedings. Something I definitely deal with in the summertime when I'm baking, trying to keep that dough cool and not exploding out of its container. I'm just kidding, it doesn't explode, but it's still a lot to take care of. So warmer environments, your starter is going to be a bit more active. If you're still dealing with some cooler environments, you know, and when I say warmer and cooler, you know, generally recipes will call for leaving your starter at room temp, which by some standard is between 70 and 75 degrees, I'm guessing. That's not what my house is all the time. We usually keep our house at around like 68 degrees if we are feeling fancy and want to keep warm. Otherwise, you know, anywhere around 65 degrees or you know, at night it gets down to sometimes 57 in the winter. So it can kind of be all over the place. I wouldn't worry too much about it, you know, in the beginning. Maybe just kind of take note of what your home's temperature is. So if it's around 70 degrees or below that, just know that you may want to find a warm spot for your starter. In the beginning, you know, some people like to put it, I don't know if you know about the oven trick for proofing dough. You know, if you've baked bread before or you've worked with yeasted breads before, some people will say you can put your dough into the oven with the pilot light on, and that creates a nice warm environment. You can put a pot of boiling hot water in there to create a nice little steamy hot chamber. Just to create what would be like a proofing box. Proof being a word for allowing your dough to have time to grow, for those yeasts and bacteria to be working and feeding off of that nice warm environment. So where to put this, I would just recommend maybe somewhere kind of high up, you know, out of reach where it's not going to get knocked over by kids or cats or or you know, just working around in the kitchen. It's nice to have it somewhere visible so that you don't forget about it, so that you're still able to look at it and see it, but probably just keeping it, you know, either on the counter out of you know, knock down region, or putting it, you know, on top of the refrigerator, which is where I keep mine. Those are all great options for doing that. So that's day one, is right here. Just flour and water, you know, a rubber band on there if you want to follow along with its progress, a very loose fitting lid. Again, I'm not going to put down that screw top mason jar lid. The reason being that I want for wild yeasts and wild bacteria to come in and check this out and see if it's something that they're into. You know, if they like this environment, then they're going to hang out and they're going to start doing their thing and feeding off of sugars and starches and creating carbon dioxide and lactic acid and all the stuff that we want for our sourdough bread. But if they can't get in there, then they're not going to want to make their homes. So you can use, you know, just a loose fitting metal lid, and the space, you know, in between will be enough for them to come in. You can also use cloth. A lot of people will use cloth top, you know, just a loose weave or, you know, an old rag or whatever you want. As long as it's clean, you can put it on top. You can either just let it sit on top, or you can use a rubber band to kind of fit around the edges if you're worried about anything getting in there. It's fun to make a nice fancy little hat for your starter. However you want to do that. More fun kid projects. You may want to name your starter. It'll help you remember to feed it. It'll help you feel more invested and love your starter, like I did with mine. But that's it. That's how easy it can be to start. Now, where do you go from here? So this goes up onto your shelf or onto your fridge. You want to let it sit for about 24 hours. Again, you may not notice activity at that point, but after 24 hours, it's time to feed it again. So what you're going to have to do at this point is to actually take some out. The reason for that is that if you feed it now and you feed it the day after that and you feed it the day after that, you're going to end up with a lot of starter. And it's going to get to the point where it's going to outgrow this container. So if you want to keep it contained, but you still want to be able to feed it in the same container and not end up with, you know, 1 million grams of sourdough starter, you have to take some out every time. So I am actually going to take some starter out of my already happy and healthy starter, David, and show you how to do a feeding. So if your starter is already active like David is, you may want to actually stir him down first. There we go. And that just kind of releases some of the gases out of there. You'll also see that he's like got some nice strength in there, almost like dough, as opposed to the gloopy mess that we have from the flour and water that we just mixed. So I'm just stirring my starter now, and you may want to do this with your new starter too. You know, if you're on day 2, you're on day 5 or whatever, just give it a little stir at first. It's going to let you feel where it's at and get to know the consistency of your starter. And now I'm going to take some out. The way that you can do that is, again, have your scale on the ready. So I am first going to figure out how much starter I have in here already. And if you remember that trick we did in the beginning, I know how much my container is in mass, so I can find out how much starter is in this container by just measuring the whole. So 512 is my total. And I'm just going to use a calculator because I don't want to get it wrong. So 512 minus, how much did this weigh? 285 grams means that I have 227 grams of starter in here. Now that's pretty nice because I can take out quite a bit of starter and still have a little bit left to feed. And that's the key with sourdough starters, that you always, always, always want to keep a little bit, reserve just the tiniest bit of starter so that you can keep it going and you don't have to start again from scratch. Whenever you're doing a recipe for bread, you know, which I recommend just going online and finding something, or if you have books at home or are still able to access your library, you know, check those out. There's not really enough time here to go over a bread recipe, but I can certainly get you started with the starter. Just keep in mind that you always, always want to keep a little bit of that starter on hand and separated from your recipe. I've heard some horror stories about people who have, you know, gone to make bread and used all of their starter. And then after they bake their wonderful bread, they realize that they don't have any starter left to make more. So again, just keep that in mind. To take some out, maybe you are baking bread and the starter that you're taking out is going right into your bread. If not, you can reserve the starter that you take out. So I just have this little container that I'm going to put in my fridge for later. I don't really have to weigh out this container. That doesn't matter to me personally. I'm going to set it down on my scale and set it to 0. And I'm going to take out, let's see, we said there's 227 grams of starter in here. So I'm going to make it so that there's 25 grams of starter in here. So I'm going to be taking out 202 grams of my starter. So now I'm just taking it out, very gloopy, and putting it into my other container, which is sitting on my scale. And again, if you were baking bread, this is active starter that you could be using to start making your dough. So this step may be just kind of the first step of your recipe. Now I've taken out right about 200, almost there, 200, so okay. 203 grams, that's close enough. So this is what 203 grams of starter looks like. A lot of, if you've already started reading about sourdough, maybe you've come across the tartine books. Those are like a great starting place for classic sourdough bread by Chad Robertson. He's a huge name in the sourdough community. Tartine, you can check it out. A lot of his bread recipes start with 200 grams of sourdough starter, so that's kind of what to expect from that. And now we just have what looks like about a tablespoon of starter left in here. And that's going to be enough to start our next batch. So again, there's about 25 grams of starter in here. And I'm putting it on my scale. I'm zeroing out the whole thing. And I'm just repeating the process. So whether you're, on day 2 of your non-active sourdough starter, you would be taking out some of this starter so that you start, I gotta find another word. No more start. Let's back up. Begin, that's a good word. Okay. So let's hop back for a minute. I'm just trying to keep things less confusing. Let's hop back with your new starter. We already went through day 1. Now we're on day 2. What we need to do is take out some of this sourdough starter so that we can begin again on feeding the starter. Every day you want to do this for maybe about a week until you get to having a nice, healthy, active, consistently bubbly starter. So I'm going to take out take out some of this. Leave maybe just 25 grams would be fine. Leave 25 grams of starter in here. Just keep with that number. It'll make it easier for you to go forward and remember just using one set of numbers. So remember the first feeding we did, we can use that again the second day for building up your starter and making it really nice and strong. So every day you're going to want to reduce your starter, take out enough that you're left with 25 grams of starter. Just remember that number. And so that you can remember it, I'm going to write it down. So leave 25 grams of starter at the beginning of every day. Take out the rest, put it in a container, put it in your fridge. You can use that in other recipes. We'll talk about that later. But just remember that you want to start out with 25 grams of starter when you're going to feed it again. You're going to do the same feeding. 25 grams of whole wheat flour, 25 grams of bread flour, or 50 grams of whatever flour choice, right? You just want to end up with 50 grams of flour for your feeding. And then add 50 grams of water. If you're not using a scale, great question. If you're not using a scale, start out by just using 2 tablespoons of flour, water. We can do that now. So let's say we're doing a tablespoon of my bread flour. And I'm adding a tablespoon of my whole wheat flour. So that's in there now. And you're going to want to add just under 2 tablespoons of water because, again, we remember water is going to weigh more than flour. So I'm going to add just under 2 tablespoons of water. And you can kind of look by, or excuse me, you can kind of go by look or feel here to make sure that you got your measurements right. This is why I like using a scale because it is so exact and easy to do. It just requires, your container and some kind of mixing utensil. But as long as you get this kind of thick consistency, almost like a thick pancake batter, that's what you want. And it's a little hard to show on a webinar, but that's what you're looking for. It's not so thin that it'll pour right out. It's going to be a little different too if you're using all whole wheat flour or all bread flour. So try to be as exact as you can in the beginning with your measurements so that you know what it's supposed to look like. You get a feel for it, you know what it's supposed to smell like, and what the activity is going to look like over time. Yeah, just consistency is key. You know, write things down if you can, observations maybe, timing. The timing isn't, you know, terribly important in the beginning as you're just getting it going. You know, make sure that you're doing it every day if you can, the feeding part. But it doesn't have to be like at 10 a.m. every day. You know, maybe a feeding in the morning, and then just keep feeding it in the morning if you can, or feeding in the evening and keep feeding it in the evening to give it that good 24-hour cycle. If it's really, really thick, it may just depend on the flour that you're using. You know, if you're using gluten-free flours especially, you're probably going to get a pretty different product. The starter is going to act very differently. So just be aware of that, and maybe you need to do a little bit more research on what to expect from those kinds of flours if you're using something that's not all-purpose bread or whole wheat flour. Rye flour is a very, very active flour, so if that's what you're using, expect it to come a little bit quicker, but it's also not going to get as high of a rise as maybe you were expecting. It's going to have a different consistency whenever you're mixing it. They're all different. So whatever you can do to just keep things consistent when you're starting out with your numbers, you know, with your method, your timing approximately in the day, that's going to give you the best way to learn what to look for. I'm going to do a quick time check. It looks like we're getting up there. So I do want to leave time for some questions. You know, obviously I wasn't able to answer everything that I saw come up in the chat. If there were things that I was able to see while I was talking, I addressed them, but Giselle, maybe you can help me out with that.
Yes, I'll jump in. There's lots of great questions, and some of this will be just you sort of clarifying or repeating a few things. So I'm going to start with this timeline, sort of go backwards. So I think just a clarification on, do we feed the starter with the same mix we made starter with every 24 hours, and each time we take out 75%-ish and leave 25, about a quarter of it behind? Is that right?
Yes, so that's a great question. I think, yeah, maybe I can explain it a different way. So on day one, you're going to start out by feeding, you know, 50 grams of flour total, right? Like the way that I like to do it, I like to break it down. If you have different flours that you want to play with, know that you can do some kind of combination like that. But basically, you're just looking for equal amounts, like 50 grams of flour to 50 grams of water. That's day one. Every day moving forward from that, you're going to want to take, as someone suggested, like 75% out. So you're going to leave behind 25 grams. You're going to take out 75 grams. It's going to seem like a lot, but you can find a use for it. So you're left with 25 grams of starter, and then you're going to do the same feeding. So from here on out, you're feeding 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. That totals to 100 grams of starter that you're creating. Now, in addition to the 25 grams you had before, you now have 125 grams of starter in your container. So if it's easiest for you moving forward, after day one, when you're only taking out 75 grams, on day 2, 3, 4, 5, however long it takes for you to get your starter going, you can always take out 100 grams of starter and then add back in 100 grams of starter. And that's just a really easy number to work with. If you're using with measuring spoons and measuring cups or whatever you have on hand, it's going to be a little bit trickier. You're going to have to just kind of eyeball it. But I wouldn't worry too much about it, because over time you're going to start to learn what it's supposed to feel like. You know, if you say, oh, I think it needs a few more drops of water, or, oh, it's, way too liquidy, I need to add more flour in, then you'll be able to figure that out over time.
Perfect. And when is the starter ready to be used for baking? At what point? Is it 1 week or 2 weeks?
Great question. Sometimes it depends. It depends on the kind of flour you're using. Not just if it's whole wheat or all purpose, or, buckwheat or rye or whatever you have, but also the age of the flour can mean that it might take longer for your starter to get going. It's all dependent on how those microbes, how those yeasts and bacteria are getting to your starter and are making their home in it. If they really like that environment, you might have a starter that's ready to be baked with in a week's time. If your flour is a little bit older, or for whatever reason, that the universe decides it's taking longer for your starter to get going, it may be more like 2 weeks. Some people swear by the starter being easier to use or tastier after a month's time of feeding it every day. To me, that seems a little excessive. I haven't noticed that much of a difference between, a week of having a starter and having my starter for 4 years. So, you can keep your starter going for really indefinitely after you get it going. But I would say usually between like 1 and 2 weeks, you'll have a pretty healthy starter going. You'll be able to note consistent rise times. What I mean by that is, if you feed your starter in the evening and it's doubled by the morning, then that's a great sign. It's going to take more time than conventional yeast to rise. Conventional yeast, you usually have doubled your dough size in 1 or 2 hours if you put it in a warm spot. Sourdough, it's going to be double or maybe even triple that. So when you're making your starter, that doubling of an overnight rise is a really good thing, and that indicates a really healthy starter. But if you're only getting a few bubbles in there and maybe it's just rising a tiny bit overnight, then you probably still have a little ways to go before it's going to give you a really lofty sourdough loaf.
Okay, great. And one big question we have is, what if I'm going out of town and I can't feed it every day? Will it continue to thrive, or do I need to have a starter sitter?
That's a great question. There are certainly ways that you can extend the time between feedings. In fact, during my off season, if I'm not baking a ton, what I like to do is take my starter and put it in the fridge. This is a really common way to save your starter for home bakers. You do not need to feed your starter every single day to have a sourdough starter. Absolutely not. So I would recommend, once you have a healthy starter going, you've been feeding it, and after a week you get these really nice rises overnight. It smells great. It's lots of bubbles. You bake some bread. It comes out great. Hooray. But now you're ready to just hold off for a bit. You're done with feeding it every day and you want to just take a break. I would recommend feeding your starter as usual and then putting it in the fridge. And that cold temperature just kind of really, really, really slows down. It's going to even look like it freezes stops the sourdough fermentation, but it really just slows it down a lot. You can keep it up there for up to a week, sometimes up to like a month of just sitting in that fridge in that sort of inactive state. And then once you're ready to bake again, you take it out of the fridge, you let it come to room temperature, maybe for like an hour or two. And then you'll probably want to take out that sourdough, what we call discard, right? You're taking out some of the sourdough starter so that you can then feed it again and get it nice and up to speed again.
Excellent. Thanks, Chloe. Another big question. So I have a few more big questions that have many questions within them. So one big one is what to do with the stuff you're taking out if you don't immediately have a project or a recipe for it to go into. And I'll tack onto that somebody said they had a very old starter and was probably ready to let it go, but didn't quite know what to do with it. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question, and something that I did say I would talk about. So we have this, again, we call it sourdough discard. That basically just means sourdough starter that you've taken out from your primary vessel and fermentation unit, right? This is my sourdough starter. This is my sourdough discard, which I took out. I haven't fed this. This already went through its active phase. I'm basically now just saying like, I'm, either gonna bake with this right away because this one is active, but if I'm not baking bread, I'm just gonna put it in the fridge. You can keep it in there kind of indefinitely. You're not worried about it being an active, bubbly, you know, culture of microbes. It's just grains that have gone through fermentation, so they're easier to digest. It's not going to be a very good leavening agent. You can't really bake a nice lofty loaf of bread with the discard after it's been sitting in your fridge for a while. So I would recommend, if you're saving your discard, just know that you're probably going to be using it in recipes more not so much bread recipes, but more like pancakes or waffles, tortillas. You can certainly throw it into some like quick breads, like banana bread, zucchini bread, muffins. And there are great resources online for how to do this. Just remember moving forward that you're basically working with equal parts of flour and water here. So if you feel pretty confident in your math skills and you're willing to make that conversion in recipes that you already have, you can certainly go ahead and throw in your discard, which is just flour and water, and substitute out some of the flour and water that you have in other recipes. Again, whether that's pancakes or waffles, that's something you can definitely do. After a while of keeping this stuff in your fridge, especially if it's discard and it's just been sitting in there for a week or a month or 2 months, you might start to notice like a little bit of gray liquid on top. It's kind of scary the first time you see it, but it's actually totally normal. There's a name for it. It's called hooch, and it's really totally fine. You can just stir it right back in. If it scares you, you can pour it off, and that's fine. It just basically means that there's still living things in here and they're hungry, but don't worry about it because you're just going to be making some simpler recipes like I keep coming back to it, but really sourdough pancakes and sourdough waffles are my favorite sourdough discard thing to make because they come together so fast and they taste delicious. So I would recommend going online and finding some recipes for that, and just playing around, especially if sourdough is still a little bit intimidating to you. Like maybe you're okay with keeping the starter, but bread is still a little scary, or maybe you just don't have the time for that. Starting out with sourdough waffles, sourdough tortillas, sourdough crackers, sourdough everything is a great way to get acquainted with it and feel comfortable doing the measurements and doing the feedings. So just have fun with it.
Awesome. Thanks, Chloe. I just want to remind everyone, if you have to jump off, I'm going to keep asking Chloe questions. If you jump off, she very kindly has offered her email address, so you can address your questions with her directly, I think. Two more questions. One big one is the last question I'll ask you is about flours specifically. A lot of folks asked about flour. One big thing is the environmental factor. So does altitude affect what we're doing with the starter in any way? And also water. If you know that you have things in the water that might affect other activity with your water, or if it's good to drink, is it good to make a starter? So could you talk to altitude and water and any other environmental factors? You spoke a little bit about if it's really hot where you are, how that might affect it. So kind of on the same line.
That is a great question regarding water, especially, basically every factor that you can think of that might affect your starter is probably going to affect your starter. In Pittsburgh, it's kind of a joke that we don't have the best drinking water. Most people, drink it anyway, and it's fine. That's just all kind of debatable. I'm not going to get too far into that, but I will say, if it's something that concerns you, if you don't feel comfortable drinking the water that you have at home, the tap water that you have, your starters probably, it will probably be okay on that water, but you might have better results if you have access to filtered water, or you have bottled water on hand. Maybe you want to do an experiment with that at home. I know that the biggest factors that can interfere with the fermentation process, chlorinated water, I think, has a negative effect on the fermentation. So if your starter is really not getting going and you're trying to figure out what's going on, maybe try switching the water source. And as far as altitude goes, I would say that does have an effect. I'm not entirely sure how it would have, what that scale would look like. I think I did know at one time, and now it's just kind of escaping me. But I would still keep with the same measurements. Still kind of try to keep track of the temperature, the ingredients that you're putting into it, and with all other factors, being put in, you should be able to still get consistent results from day to day. If you're keeping everything else consistent, you'll just learn how your starter acts at your altitude. And if you end up moving, or taking your starter with you somewhere else, and you're finding out that the altitude does affect it, you're just going to learn something new, and you're going to have to adjust to that. Your starter will probably be different, from summer to winter, if you experience pretty radical temperature changes like we do in Pittsburgh. And that can be really fun and exciting. It can also be really frustrating. So it just takes a little bit of patience as well to learn how those different environmental changes are going to affect it.
Awesome, thank you. And Elisa in the chat also offered that Colorado State University has a reference for how higher elevations, for baking in higher elevations. So maybe that is a good resource.
There you go. Yeah, actually, thank you for saying that. I do know that different elevations will mean different things for baking times, especially. So maybe if your question was more towards the end product, it's definitely going to affect that. As far as the activity of the starter itself, I'm not sure I can speak to the exact measurements, but that sounds like a great resource, and I'm probably going to check it out after as well.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to ask one big question about the flour itself, and I know that some of you have asked questions that we won't get answered in this moment, but if I can encourage you to go to the Facebook live stream and you can put your question in there, or when this goes up on YouTube, maybe continue to ask questions there or reach out to Chloe. So the last question is, there is one small question we might tack on at the end about an old starter, what to do with old starter, but for now we'll focus on making a new starter. So flours, I think we would love to know what your favorite flours for doing sourdough starters are, Chloe. A few people have asked about einkorn flour. I hope I'm saying that right.
Yeah.
And if that is a good gluten, it sounds like maybe that might be in the gluten-free or gluten-easy category. And then also, since you do have that experience with gluten-free baking, if that's an option to make a gluten-free sourdough starter, and what you would recommend doing that with. And do you recommend mixing it half and half? Here's all the little questions. So feel out if you're forgetting the many that I'm stacking here. So can we mix half and half when we start? Is that your recommendation and what you usually do? It sounds like it. And then another question is, if I made my starter with one or two types of flour, can I feed it with a different one?
Awesome questions. Yes. Yeah, the flours aspect always ends up being a rabbit hole, but here we go. So I recommend this feeding, to start out with something, for a gluten sourdough that is with gluten. The whole wheat and bread flour, I really like that combination because it kind of gives you the best of both worlds, right? Whole wheat flour doesn't have quite as strong gluten bonds, and there are some different reasons for that, but basically just knowing that like it's harder to get that lofty rise with whole wheat flour than it is with bread flour, which is what the BF stands for. So that's why I like to mix the two, is that bread flour gives the starter a little bit more of that gluten network to give you rise and to bring that to your bread, but also the whole wheat gives it that nutritional boost. You could definitely do all or none of either of these, depending on what you have and what you want to play with. I do really love, moving forward, I love using whole grain flours. I think it's the way that I'm going to want to keep baking, and the way that the best flavors, I mean, the best for you nutritionally, whole grain flours are just amazing. But I do recognize that a lot of people want to start out with something that's a little bit easier to work with. And I think bread flour or all-purpose flour, the whiter flours are a great place to start for that. As far as einkorn goes, and emmer and spelt, kemet, you may have heard of all of these names. They are all in the ancient grain category, which basically that means they're like really, really old forms of wheat. That strain of wheat has been around for a really long time. They're more easily digestible potentially by people who have gluten sensitivity. They do, however, still contain gluten. So if you are trying to lead a gluten-free lifestyle, if you are gluten intolerant, I do not recommend using einkorn or spelt or emmer or kemet. Those do still contain gluten. However, there are plenty of other gluten-free flours that you can use. Buckwheat, teff, brown rice flour, white rice flour, millet flour, amaranth flour. I mean, there are tons of them. They are generally a bit more expensive than gluten-containing flours, but they can also be used to create starters. Some gluten-free flours are easier than others to make a starter with. I've had really good luck with brown rice flour. I think it in part is because of the nutritional benefit that brown rice flour has. Again, being kind of like that whole grain, really attracts some healthy yeasty activity in there. And it's kind of following the same method as this, equal parts of flour and water. You take some out, you add in the fresh flour and water. It's going to act a little bit different from how the gluten starter is in the beginning. It may look like it's sort of collecting water on the top at first, but then it over time evens out. Teff is a great one to go with. If you can get your hands on some whole grain teff flour, which can be kind of tricky to do, it's actually been a method that's been used in like Ethiopian flatbread for a really long time. That injera bread that is often in Ethiopian restaurants, which I love. I love that stuff so much. That kind of fermentation is really successful using teff flour. Buckwheat as well. You can definitely create a buckwheat starter. Buckwheat is a little bit harder to make bread out of, but you can use it in other forms of fermented baked products. Buckwheat pancakes, for example, are a really great option for that. So those would probably be my top three, like gluten-free flours. You could also try a combination of some of those if you'd like, following the same method that I was using over here. You can play around and whatever you have on hand. Just know that it's probably gonna, if you're doing a gluten starter and a gluten-free starter, they're gonna look pretty different. One more thing that I will add when you're starting your starter, if you are a fermentation freak and you have other projects already going on, like kombucha, or you have some lacto-fermented veggies going on, maybe you're watching some of these other slow food videos and you're just starting to pile your projects together, I would recommend keeping your starter separate from those projects if you can. I have heard stories of people who have tried to start a starter and put it on their shelf with all of their other fermentation projects. And because those are all kind of open and active, you don't want the wrong kind of yeast and bacteria to inhabit your starter when you're trying to attract the kind that you want in the beginning, that are naturally occurring. Maybe if you're if you're more educated or more experienced in the fermentation world, that makes sense to you. Otherwise, you'll just have to kind of find out for yourself. Yeah, those would be my recommendations for flowers and for where to keep it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chloe. We're a little past noon, so I'm gonna wrap it up here with immense gratitude to you, Chloe. Thank you so much. I'm gonna ask you for that short little recipe so we can share with everyone who's registered for this webinar. And then also in there, we'll offer more ways to support Chloe or show Chloe your love. Her website is right behind Chloe here. So order a loaf for somebody you know. Show Chloe your love in whatever way you can. Thank you for being here today, everybody. This is a really fun experiment, and we're really excited to do more. We have 2 more live sessions scheduled for Thursday and Friday of this week, and just stay tuned because we're scheduling more all the time. On Thursday, we have the leaders of our school garden committee, kind of phase 1 of gardening with kids, so starting those seeds at home with your kids. And then on Friday, we're doing Zero Waste Minestrone with Chef Eric Lee, who's a Slow Food Nation Zero Waste chef, so that should be really fun. And also he's at home with his kids, so pretty kid friendly there. And Slow Food USA is running the Plant a Seed campaign currently, and if there was ever a better time for gardening, I don't know what it was. So get online at slowfoodusa.org and grab a Plant a Seed kit, check out what's coming up with Slow Food Live. The Plant a Seed kits will ship out later this week. So that's 6 Arc of Taste varieties for your garden. And they're all really cool. And I'm super excited to grow them, and I hope you'll grow with us. Thank you again so much, Chloe. We're so happy to have you here. And that was absolutely fantastic. Everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you sticking with it, and don't get discouraged. This is a really different way of baking, and I just hope that you're willing to kind of experiment and have fun and get to know your starter and learn.